up on today's episode of the All Aboard Podcast. We talk about the regional railroad movement, its genesis, and where it stands today. Have your tickets out of the envelope. All aboard, please. Now boarding on track number 8 is train number 1, the All Aboard Podcast, your twice weekly excursion into transportation excellence, and I am your conductor, Phil Bell, Enterprise B, PB Crisp, Mr. 645, a highly trained rail enthusiast. And as always, I'm blessed to hold the E. Hunter Harrison Chair here at the Bell Institute for Advanced Railroad Studies, where there are no degrees because the learning never ceases. And for the third time this week, it's great to be back behind this, the Brunswick Green PLB microphone. I want to give a quick programming note to those of you who follow us on Spotify, iHeart, Apple Podcasts, or otherwise. We've been unable to get the last 2 episodes uploaded to you because there's been a little bit of tech glitches with Spotify. We're getting this resolved, so we will have your episodes in arrears out there as soon as possible. And no matter what platform you're on, go ahead right now, like and subscribe to keep this on the rails. So, we will get into our topic today, which is where we will talk about regional railroads. So, question number 1, what is a regional railroad? Well, I generally define a regional as a railroad that is about 250 miles in length, route miles, or greater, and it serves a key portion of its geographic area. Now, for a quick reminder, route miles versus track miles. If you go from point A to point B, and that is 1 mile, that is 1 route mile. If you go from point A to point B and you have 2 tracks that go 1 mile, you have 2 track miles. Track miles cover the exact amount of infrastructure that's in place, whereas route miles simply covers the distance between 2 points. So as we talk about this and the length of the railroads, just remember we're talking about route miles versus track miles. Now, regional railroads are part of an advocacy group in Washington, D.C. called the American Short Line and Regional Railroad Association. Now, the ASLRRA for short is led by Chuck Baker, who I've had a great chance to get to know over the last few years when I worked as a lobbyist for Go Rail, which is the Association of American Railroads kind of grassroots arm, as well as in the time since. Chuck is a great guy. He's very accessible. He leads an outstanding staff there. And if you ever have a chance to get to Railroad Day on Capitol Hill, which is the annual Advocacy Day fly-in, when a lot of rail employees, rail enthusiasts, railroad executives, and so on come to Washington, D.C. to talk with policymakers. If you ever have the opportunity to come in, it is a great time, a great opportunity for you to not only hear about the concerns that go on with the industry, but also to see directly what it takes for the message of what we do, whether it is how we serve customers, who the customers are that we serve, the challenges that railroads are facing, the challenges that rail customers are facing, and otherwise. You get to see what it takes to convey that message to lawmakers, because I know, having worked in this, there's a lot of people that simply believe, you just send a bunch of lobbyists up there and they say a few words and that's it. Well, it's a lot more than that, and you will be surprised about what you see, what you'll learn, and it is a valuable experience. So what I encourage you to do, go over to aslrra.org and sign up for their updates, and when Railroad Day does happen, come down to Washington, D.C. and be a part of it. Now, for that reason, though, because they are often lumped in with the short lines, most people on the outside tend to look at regional railroads as being the same as short lines, and they're not. So when you look at a short line, you typically see much more of a mom and pop operation, and these carriers are often locally owned or owned by somebody relatively close by, except in the cases of the portfolio owned short lines that are part of Genesee and Wyoming and Watco, for example. And most of these carriers get their capital also locally, whether it's what the owner was able to raise, what they're able to borrow from local banks, and they do a lot more of the direct interactions with the customers than almost anyone else. So if you think about it, you have a feed mill in your town, or you have maybe a small brewery, and it's usually a short line railroad that is going to be serving that, because the short lines are very capable of coming up with bespoke service plans for these customers. What they will often do, however, is be more of what we call a handling line for a larger Class 1 carrier. That means that billing is done by the Class 1. That means the exact service that the customer is going to receive beyond his plant or facility is determined by the Class 1. And you could think of a lot of those short lines as being more or less a contract operator for the last mile of service for a Class 1 rail carrier. Regional railroads, by contrast, they typically have their own billing, determine their own rates, work directly with the Class 1s on a lot of these. That can also at times create a little bit of a contentious situation because, as with any business, it's very tough for a lot of individualistic-minded people to come together across the table and say, all right, we're going to hash it out. So it can be a little bit difficult at times, but it certainly does work. And these carriers have a lot longer line haul as their length tends to increase. Now, the majority of them tend to be Class 2 carriers, and Class 2s are railroads with $20 to $250 million in revenue, whereas Class 1s are those with $250 million and up. There have been some interesting cases such as Montana Rail Link, which was always a Class 2, even though its revenue profile would have allowed it to be a Class 1 for much longer. However, they did not want to be part of the massive paperwork filing that all Class 1 carriers, have to do. And that includes, for example, the R1 reports, which, by the way, you can see on our website at allthingstrains.com for most of the rail carriers, but we'll discuss that a little bit more later. Some of the other regional carriers that we tend to think of are the Reading, Blue Mountain, and Northern. They are, of course, on our thumbnail. They have, in addition to a very strong freight service, a very interesting and fun and enthusiastic and enjoyable tourist rail service, which includes their steam engines, the 2102 Reading T1. So if you are in Pennsylvania, please get out and see that this year and ride to make sure they are earning revenue so they keep those services going. The New York Susquehanna and Western in New Jersey, New York, and Pennsylvania. The Great Lakes Central in Michigan. The Buckingham Branch in Virginia. The Wheeling and Lake Erie, which serves Pennsylvania, West Virginia, and Ohio. And of course, the Florida East Coast Railway, which runs right up and down the East Coast between Jacksonville and Miami. What's notable to think, though, is that many of the so-called old school rail carriers are ones that would actually be regionals today. So think about the New York, Ontario, and Western, the Rutland, the Florida East Coast, the Central of Georgia. All of those carriers, if they were still around, and technically the Central of Georgia is, they would be considered to be regional carriers, at least not only by my definition, but also by that of those today who tend to make the rules. So I want to give you a little example of where I'm going with this. So let's see if our tech will cooperate today. For those of you who are watching on CP5 Cam, which is what we call our Rumble and YouTube listeners. And by the way, CP5, Control Point 5, that's where I used to go and rail fan in North Jersey when I was in middle school and high school. CP being Control Point, that was an interlocking location on Conrail's River Line. We had a great group of rail fans that would assemble there. And what was even cooler than that is we had a great group of railroaders who were also enthusiasts. Not that they wore it on their sleeve as they were doing their job, because I know for many years that was not really, in vogue, but they loved it so much when they got done doing their job, they would come out and hang out with us and taught us all so much, those of us who were enthusiasts who didn't work there. And now I can even think of at least one person, if not more, who was not a employee, but was about my age and is now working for the railroads, in the T&E service and doing an amazing job there. What you see on the screen is the Rutland Railroad. Now you can see it's going from mostly in New York State, Vermont, and also the edge of New Hampshire over to Ontario. That is a good example of what a regional railroad used to look like. The Rutland was, of course, largely abandoned. Most of that line across the northern tip of New York State is gone, but much of what's in Vermont is there now as part of today's Vermont rail system, which is another example of a regional carrier. Another one that I'd like to show you here is the aforementioned Central Georgia Railway. You see there, you're just looking at portions of Georgia, Alabama, and at the edge of Tennessee. This is what was a Class 1 railroad at one time in its heyday, but now would most certainly be considered to be a regional, and parts of it have been sold off to become short lines and regionals, while the company, or I should say a successor company of the same name, continues to exist as part of Norfolk Southern. Now, And one other thing I'd like to point out, in addition to those railroads that I just mentioned, think of this: the Erie, the Lackawanna, the New Haven, the Spokane, Portland, and Seattle, and the Jersey Central. They are all what we think of as big railroads. Today, they would be regionals, and the Erie would be the biggest of the regionals. Now, getting into where this history started, so some of the early regional efforts, one that I like to point out because it was so unique in its in the way it was set up, but then also that it sadly died and that we continue to kind of weep for it as rail fans, and that was the Wellsville, Addison, and Gailton. Now, the Wellsville, Addison, and Gailton operated in Pennsylvania and New York State, and it began operations in 1956. It was purchased by the Salzburg Company and H.E. Salzburg and Company. Salzburg was a railroad scrapper. They mostly went and purchased rail lines that were going to be abandoned, took them over, and what they would do is milk the last bit out of it and then tear it up. And they were known because they had Louisiana Northwest and also, of course, the Wellsville, Addison, and Gailton. They had a variety of others, including the Hoosick Tunnel and Wilmington, which is one that I would actually like to go visit, seeing as our last two episodes talked about Massachusetts. I'd like to go out there and visit and see what's left of the HT&W. But you can see here, Wellsville, Addison, Gailton, New York, Pennsylvania border. This is in western New York State. You have connections here, and this is why I included this in our discussion of regionals with the Erie Railroad, as well as the New York Central and the Baltimore and Ohio. So this was much more of just based on the map and based on its importance to the area, much more so than what you would think of as a 99-mile short line that doesn't really fit in with what we're talking about, but it did because of the important commodities that it carried, but also because, again, it had these relationships with Class 1 carriers, which many short and large numbers, which many short lines do not. Most short lines, as opposed to regionals, tend to be restricted in their ability to who they are able to interchange with. And this is called a paper barrier. Paper barriers, as you might read if you surf the internet long enough, have become a major point of contention for not only short line railroads, but railroad shippers and the Surface Transportation Board. In general, when you see rail spinoffs, whether we're talking about to short lines or regionals, it is very difficult for the outside investors who are purchasing this to come up with the money that's needed to acquire the track. Why is that? It's not necessarily because the track in and of itself or even the real estate under the track is necessarily all that valuable. And let's also remember that in some cases, or I should say many cases, a lot of the real estate under the track isn't necessarily owned by the railroad, but the railroad is there on an easement that they are allowed to use for as long as they're conducting rail operations. It varies based on segment and even sub-segment, you could say, of what the arrangements are for the land under the track. So if you really look at it, unless you have track that is owned in fee by the railroad in a major metro area where somebody could extend their building out for a few more feet, or you would have a government agency that wanted to buy the track for use of commuter service, or heaven forbid, creating a trail. And yeah, in case you're wondering, you come here to the All Aboard podcast, we hate rails to trails. Not so much because it's a bad idea, but because it almost always results in the obliteration of the rail line. And then you end up with a situation where someone says, well, let's bring this rail line back. And the trail advocates will never even let you enter into a situation where rail and trail are shared. But more on that for another episode. Got to get you a little rant in. But the reason why railroad track tends to be very, very expensive to purchase is simply because there's not much of it created new. And the rail carriers who sell the track, they understand this. And quite frankly, even if we disagree with valuation, it would be negligent for them to say, well, all right, we could get 80, 90, 100 million for whatever this is, but we're going to sell it for 60 or 50 million because we understand, the business doesn't exactly support that higher valuation. If they did that, they would be negligent to their stockholders because it is up to every corporation to maximize the value of its assets. So what railroads often do when it comes to short line and regional spinoffs is they will work with those carriers to find some way to lower the price. One of the more popular approaches in recent decades, which we saw a lot with the Buckingham branch, is the lease. The Buckingham branch is one, the Chicago, Fort Wayne, and Eastern on the former Pennsylvania, in Ohio, in Indiana, going into Illinois, although they get into Illinois and trackage rights, that's a second, and the Gulf and Atlantic, which is the former PA and Tallahassee subdivisions in North Florida. Those are situations where either the track was leased from the Class 1, or in other cases, the track structure on top of the land was sold to the regional carrier or the short line carrier, and the underlying right-of-way continued to be held in whatever form it was held by the Class 1. So these were ways where you could get somebody to come in who could operate that track and maybe do a better job of serving those customers, provide a cash payment to the Class 1, which certainly helps their bottom line, and then also relieve them of the need to maintain and serve that. But it doesn't entirely take them out of the equation. And why do you not want them to go out of the equation? Well, a lot of railroads, and I should say every Class 1 railroad, has an abiding fear. And that abiding fear has been realized in many cases. And the best example that we can think of is the Wisconsin Central, because the Wisconsin Central, which was owned by the Soo Line, and this is track that we're talking about, extends from Chicago up to the Twin Cities, Chicago, Milwaukee, Twin Cities, and then into the Upper Peninsula of Michigan. So very large in the state of Wisconsin, and for many years was one of the most storied lines in the history of post-Staggers railroading, because for quite some time, it really did grow as if it were a tech company, at the same time when tech companies were becoming the number one thing in American business consciousness. So when their stock price was going up and their shareholders were earning great returns because Wisconsin Central was publicly traded, life was good. But then things started to slow down, and the reasoning for that is legion, and we'd like to do a multi-part on this, and I'm hoping to get some of their former executives on to join us to discuss that. But eventually the stock price started to decline. The shareholders became restless. The leader, Ed Burkhart, was thrown out of Wisconsin Central. And what happened, the folks who took over, Bob Wheeler, Tom Power, and Riley McCarran, ended up selling the carrier to Canadian National. Now, this came after Burkhart went on a crusade against Wisconsin Central by creating something like the Committee to Preserve Shareholder Value, and this helped to prompt the sale. Now, what does all that mean? It means that track that the Soo Line, which was part of Canadian Pacific, used to own, has now become a key part of Canadian Pacific's primary competitor, Canadian National. So a lot of railroads, when they're receiving a proposal or they're considering, should we spin off this track, they're worried something like that could happen. That a group of lines that may not have been core to them could suddenly come back and punch them in the face financially as a competitor. That's something they want to avoid. So therefore you get to the paper barrier. And the paper barriers will say things such as, you cannot interchange with this railroad that you connect with. You can only interchange with us. Or there will be controls that if there's going to be a sale, the selling carrier who sold you that line or leased you that line would have to approve that agreement. So that way you wouldn't have another situation like what happened with the Wisconsin Central. But the paper barriers have become contentious for the shippers and also the Surface Transportation Board, because there are a lot of shippers who will be located on a short line carrier, not generally regional, but occasionally there. And they'll say, well, wait a minute. We don't like the service that we're getting from the connecting railroad, and what we want to do is interchange with someone else. We want to make them compete for our business. We want lower rates. Lower rates are always a big deal. So, of course, they complain, and then they're always reminded, well, look, the reason that short line was able to get this track for less than the real market value is because we included the paper barrier in. I am personally a defender of paper barriers, and I'll tell you why. As I mentioned earlier, this is because the carriers who sell have to maximize the value of the assets that they have. And if they're not able to do that, you will end up in a situation where what the selling carrier will do is the only thing they're able to do. Either, number one, sell it for market value to someone who's able to pay that, which is tough because, quite frankly, as we'll see when we talk about the Chicago, Missouri, and Western in a few minutes, banks are, and raising capital is very difficult to do for any railroad at any time, in particular one that's going to be coming in new, even if the operation itself has been established for centuries. And number two, so if that's the case, well, what do? You either sell to that person, assuming they have money. Oftentimes they don't. You sell or lease to a short line or regional that is able to cope with the paper barrier and then find ways to not so much work around it, but to get some service that works for both the Class 1 carrier, the short line, and its customer. Or number three, simply continue to operate the service until it dies. And sadly, there are a lot of segments out there that we see that end up doing the latter, because not only is there a concern about the paper barrier, or there's not really a realistic way that the Class 1 carrier can say, well, if we spin this off, how will that not come back to bite us? So that's why I'm very much in favor of the paper barriers. And I also say to those who want to be short line entrepreneurs like me, I may want to be short line regional entrepreneur. I don't own one, not yet. If you want to do this, you have to be able to truly understand what the value of that property is, what that value means to the Class 1 carrier, and be prepared to pay a substantial amount over what it's worth in order to get that out of their hands, and be willing to work with them so that in the future, more of this is able to happen. As an aside, and I know we're going on a little bit of tangent here, I believe that the regional railroad model is one that is very key to the future of the rail industry, because of the way that the Class 1 railroads, thanks to the long negative regulatory policy, had to consolidate for many years and wring a lot of economies of scale out of their operation. I certainly envision a future where you're going to see a lot of regional railroads like the Reading Blue Mountain Northern, the Florida East Coast, the Wheeling and Lake Erie, and so forth, doing a lot more of the work of serving customers and being the interaction vehicle with short lines, and that Class 1s will have much longer hauls, be much more profitable than they are even now, and will be that wholesale transportation that works with their primary customers, who will then be the regional railroads and also large shippers such as Hanjin and CSCO and so on. So that said, let's just move back onto the regional railroad movement overall. So we had the Wellsville, Addison, and Gailton, and that started in 1956. It operated, it interchanged, it always had problems. It was a very difficult place to operate, simply because Western New York and Northwestern Pennsylvania, outside of having some areas that have industrialized, really haven't developed all that much. They are largely agricultural. The railroad, then as now, didn't offer that much of a benefit over trucks for what's there, largely because there's not a whole lot that's there. And a lot of the railroads who did serve the area were either going to serve mineral deposits like coal, which is one of the things that brought the B&O out there in the first place, or they were like the Erie and Erie-Lackawanna, who passed through on their way to areas that were much larger in terms of traffic. And that is whether we're talking about the northwestern Pennsylvania area around Meadville, and then into the steelmaking territory around Youngstown and Rubber and Akron and so on. And of course, in the Erie's case, on the way to Chicago. So sadly, the Wellsville, Addison, and Gailton got in the 1970s, didn't go much further. That's it. At least two of their F7s are still around, and I believe that they're now down at the Galveston Railroad Museum, painted in faux Santa Fe scheme. We'll do a little post to show you some of the pictures I took of those back in 2020. 1977, though, this is when more of the modern era, so-called modern era, of short lines and regionals started. And this came with the Maryland and Delaware, which is still operating today. So J.A. Tony Hanold and was able to put together a group of investors who didn't acquire track in this case, but what they did is they obtained the right to operate over these lines. Many of them are seen here now. The purple core, as you see, that is the Delmarva, Norfolk Southern's Delmarva line, which is mostly now operated by Carload Express and also Norfolk Southern, and it goes down into Virginia. Unfortunately, no longer down to the tip of the eastern shore of Virginia, as that has been abandoned. That portion was the Virginia and Maryland, and the remainder, and you see the little icons there, that is the Maryland and Delaware. Tony Hanold, he put those lines together because they had been excluded from the final system plan, which is what we better know as Conrail. The final system plan is the final plan that was developed by the United States Railway Association, the second USRA, pursuant to both the 3R and the 4R Act. And believe me, we will have some episodes where we talk extensively about both of those acts and Conrail's creation. But these were lines, as with thousands of miles throughout the northeastern and midwestern United States, that were not included in the final system plan because the central planners who came up with this, many of whom were actually private railroad executives, said, you know what, if we operate this, it's not going to be profitable for us to do so. And so what happened as a result is some of these lines were abruptly shut down on Conrail Day, April 1st, 1976. Whatever it started, finished, and then that was it. Others of these lines were operated under contract by Conrail for a period of time. The operation was subsidized, and the folks who were doing the subsidy, whether we're talking about shipper groups, but mostly states, were able to continue to fund this operation, and also the USRA, for a period of time until that expired. Once that expired, they had to find someone else in order to do that, or they had to simply shut the lines down. And in this case, one of the ones that has been very successful is the Maryland and Delaware, and they are operating here on Maryland, the Delmarva Peninsula, serving Maryland and also portions of Delaware. In fact, Maryland and Delaware has become so successful that they have now purchased railroads in New Jersey and have continued to expand their business, working closely with the Black River and Western and so on. Now, that brings us to the 1980s and Venango River Corporation. Now, this was a very interesting and I guess you could say difficult thing to research if you don't have one of these. And this is an old magazine from Trains. This is actually September 1992. But what I recommend all of you do, besides like and subscribe to the All Aboard podcast, because listen, it's great here, is get as many of Old Trains magazine copies that are available that you can. Number one, you can get them cheap. But number two, right up until you get to the late 1990s, Trains was a very in-depth journal of railroading. Nowadays, because of the way the internet has shifted things, the articles are not as long, they're not as in-depth, and quite frankly, they're not as well done. And I want to be clear, I am not trying to throw stones at Trains magazine. I'm just telling you like it is. But Old Trains, up until the late 1990s, was outstanding, and you absolutely need the physical copies in your home. For our part, we are going to start in the third quarter to put out a Harvard Business School HBS review style magazine, and that's going to be something that's done quarterly, so there'll be one each quarter. We'll start in the third quarter of 2024, and that is going to be very much like Old Trains, except there's going to be a lot more in-depth articles in each one because it's quarterly, so we want you to read over the full quarter. But what I did is I went to my collection, and it's extensive, and I was lucky enough to get them from a fellow rail fan who's actually in this area, and researched Chicago, Missouri, and Western. Now, this is a railroad that only operated solvently for about 2 years, and that's why it's so difficult to get a lot of information, especially on the internet, about the CM&W. But it was part of Venango River Corporation, which was led by a man named John Darling, and it was made up of people from the Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe, as well as one individual from Sears. In 1984, Venango River acquired the Chicago South Shore and the South Bend. Now, we all know the CSS and SB as being an interurban that was part of Sam Insull's empire, along with the Chicago North Shore and Milwaukee, and it is, of course, best known for the Little Joe Electrics. And you know what? I would be doing you a incredible disservice if I didn't put some Little Joes on the screen. So if you're watching on CP5 cam, here you go. Those are Little Joe Electrics in the 1980s, operating, pulling freight for the South Shore while it was still owned by the Chesapeake and Ohio. Now, it's worth it to mention why the South Shore became part of the C&O, because it goes a lot to the Chicago, Missouri, and Western as well. The South Shore, being an interurban as being a freight carrier, is not something you normally associate with a large diverse traffic base, Class 1 carrier like the Chesapeake in Ohio, who by just about around that time was taking control of the Baltimore and Ohio as well, to be a ideal buyer, ideal asset for the C&O to purchase. But they did, and this is because of two reasons. Number one, the C&O wanted access to Burns Harbor. Burns Harbor is a very industrialized area with plenty of steel plants. It's right on the shores of Lake Michigan in the Dunes area. So if you're going through that area, and it's really easy to do if you ride Amtrak's Lakeshore Limited, their Michigan trains and so forth, you can see a lot of it. You can see the dunes themselves, which are on their own very interesting, and there's some parks that you can visit and explore. But you'll see a lot of the United States Steel and other steel plants that are out there. So the C&O wanted access to that traffic. The South Shore had a problem because since they could not guarantee the car supply that Bethlehem Steel, which at the time was one of the large customers out there, needed, Bethlehem Steel said, well, look, we're not going to do business with you. And car supply is a big issue for short line and regional railroads because oftentimes these carriers do not have a large enough group of cars that they own to put into the national system to the extent that they can be guaranteed that cars will come to them when they need it to be loaded for customers. So therefore, working with the C&O guaranteed the South Shore that it would have a large car supply, and the South Shore basically does meet the standard of being a regional railroad. Now, in 1984, the C&O is on its way out because it is now merged with the Seaboard Coastline to create CSX. At the time, the C&O was still in existence and had its own identity as part of the Chessie system. The Seaboard Coastline Railroads had been merged into the Seaboard system. They were the two operating units of CSX. There was no more of a need for the C&O to do this. They had, I believe they were able to get access to Burns Harbor via the B&O as well. So this was now something they didn't need, and the South Shore just kind of existed. It struggled with its passenger revenue problem for many years, but it was able to finally get a subsidy from NICTD, which is, I think, Northern Indiana Commuter Transportation District. Don't kill me if I get that acronym wrong, but NICTD, which today owns the South Shore's right-of-way and owns the trains, where the passenger trains, whereas now the freight operation has become a tenant railroad. And this happened after the Venango River era. But anyway, in 1984, Venango River, they purchased the South Shore. Things go really well for a little while. Then in 1987, they reached an agreement with Illinois Central Gulf to purchase 631 miles of its former Chicago and Alton route. Now, let's get you a map here on CP5 Cam, or roughly a map on CP5 Cam. And by the way, shout out to the guys who run American-Rails.com. We use a lot of their stuff here on the All Aboard podcast because it is easy to get maps and some of the items that may not necessarily be online elsewhere. Now, let's try to zoom in a little bit. What you're seeing now is the Chicago and Alton from, I believe this is the 1920s. And so the reason why we're doing that is there's not a really good map of the CM&W, which again is why you really do need to get your Trains magazines from the old days, because there is a great map in Trains magazine, and I'm sorry, just haven't had a chance to scan it in yet. But what you see there is a carrier that runs between the outside of Chicago. In the case of the CM&W, it is Joliet, Illinois, to St. Louis via Bloomington and Springfield. Bloomington, of course, home to a major university. Springfield being the capital of Illinois. Now, at Roothouse, Illinois, the line goes west to Kansas City, and it serves communities of Mexico and Independence along the way. So, at its outset, this seems like a great idea. Here is a large piece of railroad, 600 plus miles of railroad, located in Illinois and Missouri. There were, I believe, over 1,000 shippers located on the line, and you have interchanges with just about every railroad. Now, Unlike the paper barrier situation we were talking about before, Illinois Central Gulf had no problem with them coming in and interchanging with other carriers. So Joliet, for example, you get the Santa Fe. St. Louis, you get the Eastern carriers. In this case, Conrail, CSX, Norfolk Southern. You also get Western carriers such as Southern Pacific, because Southern Pacific through the Cotton Belt came up to St. Louis, East St. Louis at the time. In Kansas City, you get Union Pacific, and so on. And also Missouri Pacific, as well as access to the Denver and Rio Grande Western as time went on and a lot more changes were made to the networks and trackage rights being offered and so on at that time. Now, to get this trackage away from the Illinois Central, the Venango River Corp, also known as the Flying Venango Boys, they had to pay $79.4 million to the Illinois Central Gulf. And to do that, they borrowed $86.65 million from Citicorp and Heller Financial. And this is where the problem started. The purchase price, now this comes from case text, and the actual bankruptcy from ICG was actually $86.6 million. So the sources do vary a little bit there. Venango contributed a massive amount of equity, $55,000. And so this gives you a debt to equity ratio that ranged between 150,000% and 200,000%. For those of you who were following the bankruptcy of Lehman Brothers and some of those other companies, and you would think, oh my gosh, the debt to equity is really out of hand here. Well, it really got out of hand with the Chicago, Missouri, and Western as well. Now, I wanted to mention that because this is something that a lot of people really look at as being the downfall of the Chicago, Missouri, and Western. I don't look at it that way. I am not averse to high leverage simply because high leverage just means that you understand interest and principal payments are there. You also understand you have to have the business to service the interest and principal payments. And that was the real problem. It's that the folks at Venango River didn't fully understand what they were buying, and they were relatively naive about the relationship that they were going to have going forward with Illinois Central Gulf. Part of this they tried to remedy by reaching an agreement with ICG where they would where ICG would largely preserve the existing traffic flows over the Chicago, Missouri, and Western. This is something that Venango River wanted, and then it is also something that Citicorp wanted because they were concerned. Now, why do I say this is a downfall and one of the problems? That's because no matter what, you cannot operate your business in the belief that someone else is going to serve and be your customer. And this is effectively saying, well, look, ICG, we're going to buy this from you. We want you to continue to be our customer. They have no reason to do that. And quite frankly, as we mentioned before, it would be negligent for them to do so. So while a lot of the sources, including Mike Blaszak's great piece, and he did a 3-part piece in September, October, and November 1992 trains on the Chicago, Missouri, and Western, it paints ICG, I think, in a little bit of a negative, well, very much in a negative light, because they under-maintain the track and so on. You've got to remember that ICG, at the end of the day, they've got a duty to their shareholders, and it'd be very difficult for them to say, look, we didn't try to do all we can because we agreed with these other guys that we would continue to send traffic over their railroad. The shareholders would say, why'd you sell it to them in the first place? And if you did, why did you agree to send traffic over their railroad? We invested in this railroad, not that one. So that was one of the big problems. The traffic that they were supposed to receive never met up with what their expectation was. The second thing, and this is something that is always difficult when it comes to any railroad operation, is that ICG did not have records, or at least did not make them available, as to what traffic was actually moving over the lines on the different segments. This is something that can be very difficult to understand at any time. And that's because just like if you try to figure out where are all the people on the highway going, it's always difficult to figure out where is all the traffic on the railroad going. Are these cars going to the ship? Are these boxcars going to that shipper down the track? Potentially, or they might be going from somewhere else. What about these lumber cars? Are they normally traveling over this line, or are they going somewhere else? Why are they here? That can vary day by day. So even though there are a lot of railroads that do have detailed records, and having attempted to buy some short lines and regionals, I've had a chance to see some of these presentations. While they have that, you cannot take that as gospel, because if you're doing a very detailed look and you said, hey, I want to buy this line, we're going to spend every day for a year investigating what it is, watching to see what cars move over, where they go, and so on, that can vary because the railroad, like I said, can have a variety of reasons for sending it over, and it doesn't mean it's going to come to you if that ends up being your railroad. So, in addition to that, you also saw that ICG had the track decline over the years because it wasn't core to them. And so Mike Blaszak writes in 1979, part of this line was shut down between Springfield and Kansas City because they had problems with the block signaling system. So ICG just turned it off. They got rid of the signals. No more problem. They also hosted Amtrak between St. Louis and Joliet. That meant another difficulty because it was part of Amtrak's core system, and Amtrak was therefore able to say, and this is the former Gulf Mobile in Ohio, what Ann Rutledge and now today is the Texas Eagle. Amtrak was able to say, you must continue to maintain the track at a state as it was when we first got here, because that was part of the deal with Amtrak, is that they were concerned, the federal government was concerned in creating it, that if they said, okay, we're going to take these trains off your hands, how do we know that the Class 1 carrier that sold it won't say, well, you know what? Those aren't our trains anymore. We're going to make this a 20-mile-per-hour main line or 20-mile-per-hour branch line, but don't worry, we'll keep the track for you to operate over. That was never really a concern or never really a possibility, but it was a concern. Because, again, you're now having separate entities do this. So that was part of Amtrak's enabling legislation. And Amtrak spoke up and they said, hey, we are concerned in part because the CMNW will be highly leveraged. We need to make sure the track will stay up to its standard. And therefore, both Amtrak and the CMNW ended up in agreement with the Illinois Central Gulf that ICG would be investing some for track maintenance above and beyond what the Chicago, Missouri, and Western was able to do. And the final part was that Chicago to Joliet segment. They did have operating rights to get in, and so therefore they were able to not only interchange with other carriers, but they were able to meet up with the South Shore, and that was able to provide a little bit of a longer haul for them. Let's also remember that when you are a tenant railroad, you are not the most important thing to the railroad that owns the track. They've got their own trains they have to run. They will run your trains ideally on the schedule, but that also means if you show up late, they're not necessarily going to say, oh, shucks, you know what? Phil Rail's here. Phil Rail was supposed to be here an hour ago. And for my friends, I always like to show up late. Okay, we're going to go ahead and run their train now. They're going to say, no, we've got 5 or 6 trains that we've got to put through that are our own and maybe other tenant railroads before we have a window to get to you. And this is something that Amtrak experiences a lot and why they are always very much in a contentious relationship with their host carriers, whether they be Class 1, Class 2, or otherwise. So all this together made for a very difficult situation. And then by 1988, the Chicago, Missouri, and Western was bankrupt. And what ended up happening, a portion of the line between St. Louis and Chicago, that was purchased by the Southern Pacific. We mentioned Southern Pacific earlier. It came up from using the Cotton Belt from Arkansas into Illinois, East St. Louis, and this was for many years their eastern frontier. Now they were able to get into the Chicago area. So that was part of Southern Pacific Chicago St. Louis, or SPICL as it was known there. And that is part of the reason why, as the 1990s wore on until SP was taken over by the Union Pacific, you would see trains of the Southern Pacific using operating rights to get into Chicago later on the Burlington Northern. So if you were on the racetrack, you would see, in addition to E-units and commuter trains, E-units on their commuter trains, or BN freights, you would also see Southern Pacific rolling up that line. That's what happened there. The western portion between St. Louis and Kansas City became the Gateway Western, which Riley McCarran, who played a key role in the Wisconsin Central later on, created, and then ended up selling to the Kansas City Southern, where it remains part of it. And actually, it is 2 separate railroads, the Gateway Western and the Gateway Eastern. The Gateway Eastern having the portions in Illinois, whereas the Gateway Western is most of the portion across Missouri. So, what do we learn? Number 1, regional railroads are a very critical part of our railroad network. Number 2, It is incredibly difficult to buy a railroad, and there are a lot of factors that go into it. Number 3, understanding how the railroad operates and what's operating over it is not something that's for the faint of heart. There's a lot that goes into it, and it can be just as tough as trying to understand where all the people on the highway are coming from and going to. And number 4, we're going to talk more about the regionals, this time with some of the more successful stories, including the Wisconsin Central, the New York Susquehanna and Western, and the one that I'm the most interested in talking about, which is a regional that never was, called the Winona Bridge. So, what I hope you'll do is see us down the main line, and as always, like, subscribe, and when you wake up in the morning, don't go to Instagram, go to allthingstrains.com and check us out there. We'll see you later, and I hope you have a great day.